The streets of Nairobi are buzzing with whispers, tension thick in the air like a storm that refuses to break. Parliament and the presidency, two mighty arms of government that should work together, are instead sharpening their blades against each other. The question is no longer if they will clash, but when. And when that moment comes, it may shake Kenya to its very core. It began with words sharp as daggers. President William Ruto accused members of parliament of taking bribes, millions of shillings, to pass laws that should serve the people. His words echoed like thunder in the chambers of the National Assembly. But instead of silence or shame, his accusations sparked fury. "We will not sit back," lawmakers declared. "If he wants war, we will give him war." What followed has stunned an entire nation. Cabinet ministers daring MPs to bring impeachment. Legislators comparing the president to a hyena devouring its own children. Names named, fingers pointed, and the promise of a censure motion hanging in the air like a loaded gun. In a country already strained by poverty, unemployment, and rising costs of living, this is not just political theater. It is a fight for survival, and the people of Kenya are watching with unease. So we must ask, is Kenya about to witness its biggest showdown yet? Will this bitter war between parliament and the presidency end with reform, or will it drag the nation further into instability? And most importantly, what lessons should the rest of Africa and even the world take from this dangerous political storm? Stay with us. Because this story is not just about Kenya. It is about power, corruption, betrayal, and the desperate struggle for dignity. Please share this video if you believe Africa deserves leaders who take responsibility, not blame games. And subscribe if you believe the truth should always speak louder than the headlines. The storm did not arrive with tanks or soldiers. It arrived with words heavy enough to split a government in two. It began when President William Ruto stood before the nation and cast a thunderous accusation that members of Kenya's parliament had taken bribes 10 million shillings to pass the anti-money laundering bill. His voice carried not just a warning, but a threat. "We will arrest them. We will prosecute them. We will not be shamed." These words rang across the chamber, jolting lawmakers who had grown used to quiet deals behind closed doors. For many Kenyans, corruption is no stranger. They have seen it at the clinics when medicine is missing, in schools where teachers go unpaid, and on the streets when young people wander jobless. But for the president to accuse parliament so openly, so boldly, was a break from tradition. It was not diplomacy. It was war. The first response came not from opposition benches, but from a man close to power. Cabinet Secretary for Energy Davis Opio stood firmly beside the president. His tone was not cautious, it was defiant. "If they want war, we will give them war," he declared. His words lit the fuse. The gloves were off. Inside Parliament, the reaction was immediate. Bumula MP Jack Wamboka, furious at the president's remarks, rose to his feet. His voice carried both anger and resolve. "We will not sit back and watch as the president smears this entire house," he warned. Then, with words that would set the stage for the days to come, he promised to table a motion of censure, an attempt to punish the president for crossing the line. What had begun as a speech had now become a battle plan. The chamber filled with noise, applause, jeers, shouts of approval and condemnation. Wamboka's declaration electrified the assembly. "We are now going to exercise our teeth. We are going to bite," he thundered. The symbolism was unmistakable. Parliament would not be a toothless watchdog. It was ready to attack. Hours later, the drama spilled beyond the floor of Parliament. Speaker Moses Wetangula, guardian of the House, whisked a group of lawmakers to a retreat in Mombasa. Officially, it was a closed-door meeting. In reality, it was a war council. There, Wetangula delivered words that would echo far beyond the retreat. He compared the president to a hyena. When a hyena wants to eat its children, it first accuses them of smelling like goats. The parable was sharp-cutting and unforgettable. It painted Ruto not as a reformer, but as a predator willing to devour his own allies when it suited him. In one metaphor, the fragile bond between the presidency and parliament shattered in the public eye. At the center of it all was one undeniable truth: both sides were now fighting for survival. The president believed that naming and shaming would strengthen his authority. Parliament believed that pushing back, even threatening impeachment, was necessary to defend its honor. Neither side blinked. This was not just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of institutions. On one side, the executive armed with accusations and threats of prosecution. On the other, the legislature fueled by anger and the determination to assert its independence. The streets of Nairobi buzzed with speculation. Could Parliament really impeach the president? Could a sitting head of state actually fall to the fury of MPs? As the first act of this unfolding drama closed, one thing was clear. Kenya had entered uncharted waters. The president had dared to accuse, and Parliament had dared to defy. The war of words had begun, and no one could predict where it would end. The confrontation did not cool down after Parliament's heated session. Instead, it escalated like dry grass catching fire in the wind. What began as accusations had now grown into a full-fledged political inferno. The turning point came when Speaker Moses Wetangula, a man known for his careful words, dropped a parable that stunned even his closest allies. Speaking before a group of MPs in Mombasa, he likened the president to a hyena. When a hyena wants to eat its children, it first accuses them of smelling like goats. It was a chilling metaphor. In Kenya, the image of a hyena is one of greed, betrayal, and destruction. Wetangula was not just criticizing, he was declaring that the president had turned predator using Parliament as a scapegoat to protect himself. The remark spread like wildfire. On radio talk shows, in cafes, and across social media, Kenyans dissected the meaning. Was the president truly betraying his own allies, or was the speaker using ancient wisdom to cloak his own defiance? Within hours, members of Parliament seized on the parable to intensify their attack. They accused President Ruto of hypocrisy, condemning corruption with one hand while feeding it with the other. One lawmaker stood on the floor and thundered, "Kenyans know the temple of corruption is not in Parliament. It is in State House itself." The chamber erupted. To accuse the very seat of the presidency of being the shrine of corruption was a line few dared cross. Yet the words hung heavy, impossible to take back. Then came the most explosive charge of all. JJ George Quimbery, abandoning caution, named names. He alleged that millions of shillings were being distributed to lawmakers through Majority Leader Kimani Ichung'wah money that he claimed originated from the president himself. This was no longer rumor. This was a direct accusation of bribery against the highest office in the land. The room shook with gasps and murmurs. For the first time, the narrative flipped. Instead of Parliament defending itself from accusations, it was now the president being painted as the mastermind of corruption, the prefect of bribery, as one MP put it. The irony was brutal. A president who had promised to jail corrupt lawmakers now stood accused of paying them off for his own political survival. Across Nairobi, the public's reaction was raw and divided. Some applauded the president for daring to call out corruption, seeing him as a man trying to reform a broken system. Others, weary from years of broken promises, saw only another politician playing a dangerous game of blame. If he knows who took the bribes, why hasn't he arrested them, callers asked on national radio. And if he gave the bribes himself, how can he claim to be clean? International observers, too, began to take note. Kenya's reputation as a stable democracy in East Africa was now under question. The sight of MPs threatening impeachment cabinet secretaries, daring Parliament to bring it on, and the speaker calling the president a hyena painted a picture of a government devouring itself. The atmosphere in Parliament turned electric, almost theatrical. Lawmakers pounded on their desks, shouting over each other as accusations flew back and forth. Some demanded immediate investigations by the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, DCI. Others called for the president himself to step aside pending inquiry. Every word spoken was like gasoline on the fire, and yet through the chaos, one thing became undeniable. Kenya's crisis was no longer about a single speech. It had become a battle for legitimacy, a question of who truly represented the people, the presidency accusing or the parliament accused. Each side believed the other was the greater threat. Each side was determined to survive. The showdown had reached its highest pitch. The accusations were no longer whispers but screams, no longer suggestions but open declarations. A hyena, a temple of corruption, millions of shillings traded for loyalty, this was the language now defining Kenya's political life. And for the millions watching from the streets, the villages, and the world beyond, the fear was real. When leaders turn on each other like predators, it is always the people who bleed. When the dust settled from the shouting in Parliament, ordinary Kenyans were left to wonder, what does this battle mean for us? For people struggling to afford food, for families waiting at clinics with empty medicine shelves, and for youth searching desperately for jobs, the fight between the presidency and Parliament was more than just political drama. It was a reminder that those in power seemed consumed with survival, not service. Across Nairobi's crowded matatu stations, commuters shook their heads. "They are fighting about money while we are fighting to eat," one woman said bitterly. In villages far from the capital, radios buzzed with angry debates. Farmers who had been promised subsidies asked whether any law could now pass without being poisoned by corruption or vendettas. Civil servants whispered about delayed salaries, fearing that the government's paralysis would soon touch their lives directly. The political consequences were just as severe. By accusing Parliament of corruption and then being accused of bribery himself, President Ruto had opened a wound that would not heal easily. The opposition seized the moment, painting the president as both reckless and compromised. Within the ruling coalition, cracks began to appear. Lawmakers who once stood solidly behind the executive now found themselves questioned by constituents. Are you serving us or pocketing the president's money? For Parliament, the cost was equally heavy. While MPs roared about their honor being smeared, the people outside saw only a house divided, filled with self-interest. The credibility of the National Assembly, already weakened by years of scandals, now seemed near collapse. Instead of projecting authority, it projected chaos, leaders shouting insults, staging retreats, and comparing their president to a hyena. The possibility of impeachment loomed like a dark cloud. Some MPs whispered that the numbers might be there. Others warned that even a failed attempt could destabilize the nation. Kenya, after all, has endured painful political transitions before. Memories of post-election violence still haunt the people. The fear was not just about leadership. It was about whether the fragile peace could hold if institutions tore each other apart. Civil society organizations began to raise alarms. Activists argued that the political war was distracting from urgent issues: drought relief in arid regions, food insecurity, and ballooning national debt. Churches and mosques urged calm, warning leaders against devouring one another while the nation starves. In editorials, newspapers spoke bluntly: Kenya was risking a constitutional crisis. Meanwhile, the international community watched with unease. Foreign investors, already wary of regional instability, hesitated. Human rights groups warned that as the executive and legislature fought, the temptation to silence critics could grow. For ordinary Kenyans, these warnings meant little. They were too busy trying to survive. But the sense of drift was clear. Perhaps the most painful consequence was psychological. Citizens who once believed in democracy as a path to accountability now saw a theater of corruption where each actor accused the other, but no justice was served. Trust in leadership, already fragile, eroded further. Many began to ask if both the presidency and parliament are corrupt. Who speaks for the people? This erosion of trust cut deep. In a region where political turmoil in neighboring countries often spills across borders, Kenya's instability could ignite wider insecurity. At home, it meant that young Kenyans, those who once lined up to vote with hope, now spoke of politics with cynicism. "They are all thieves," a university student sighed. "We are just pawns in their game." And so the crisis took root not only in government chambers, but in the hearts of the people. A war between institutions had become a wound across the nation. Kenya was left more fragile, more divided, and more uncertain than ever before. From Washington to Brussels, from Addis Ababa to New York, the storm inside Kenya's parliament was not seen as a domestic quarrel alone. It was read as a warning sign. One of East Africa's most stable democracies was beginning to unravel from within. For the United States, the spectacle was especially troubling. Kenya has long been America's most reliable partner in East Africa, an anchor in counter-terrorism operations against al-Shabaab, a hub for regional trade, and a crucial diplomatic ally. But an open war between the executive and the legislature posed a new question. How stable is Kenya really? Analysts in Washington quietly admitted their concern. A president accusing lawmakers of bribery, lawmakers accusing the president of being the prefect of corruption, and cabinet secretaries daring parliament to bring it on such scenes, chipped away at Kenya's image as a model democracy. The fear was not only political instability, it was strategic. If Kenya faltered, America's entire security architecture in the Horn of Africa could weaken. Europe, too, watched with unease. Brussels already faced criticism for overlooking governance problems in Kenya while pushing trade deals. Now European diplomats wondered aloud whether they had misjudged the resilience of Kenya's institutions. Investors sensitive to instability began slowing new commitments. For ordinary citizens, this meant more economic uncertainty, an indirect but painful consequence of political drama. The African Union, which often champions dialogue, found itself cornered. Could it intervene, or would it stand aside while one of its flagship democracies tore itself apart? Many African observers noted the irony. While the AU preached African solutions for African problems, it remained silent as Kenya's leadership plunged into mutual accusations. And then there was the comparison with Burkina Faso. Across Africa, citizens drew parallels between President William Ruto's public quarrel with parliament and President Ibrahim Traoré's different style of leadership. In Ouagadougou, Traoré had shocked the world by dissolving Western-style electoral bodies and confronting corruption head-on, claiming that imposed institutions had failed Africa. In Nairobi, by contrast, the clash looked like the worst of both worlds, imported democracy unraveling under the weight of mutual distrust. Commentators across the continent asked a difficult question: who truly embodies reform, Ruto with his noisy accusations or Traoré with his radical restructuring? While critics of Traoré accused him of authoritarianism, his supporters insisted he had avoided the spectacle of institutional collapse now haunting Kenya. In their eyes, Burkina Faso projected unity and sovereignty, while Kenya exposed the cracks of imitation democracy. For America, this contrast was uncomfortable. Washington has frequently criticized Traoré as a strongman, yet here was Kenya, its democratic ally, sliding into chaos under the weight of corruption and political rivalry. The narrative of democracy versus autocracy grew harder to sell when the so-called democracy looked more fragile than the so-called strongman state. In global media, the imagery was brutal. Kenyan MPs shouting the speaker, likening the president to a hyena, and allegations of millions exchanged for votes painted a picture of dysfunction. International outlets contrasted this with rising calls for sovereignty and reform across Africa, suggesting that ordinary people might now see radical alternatives as more credible than fragile democracies. The world's gaze, therefore, was not just on Kenya's crisis, it was on Africa's crossroads. If one of Washington's strongest allies could stumble so badly, what did it say about the future of democratic governance in the continent? And if leaders like Traoré continued to rise, offering order and sovereignty in place of corruption and division, how would America and the West respond? The answers remained uncertain. But one truth was clear: Kenya's storm was no longer only Kenya's problem. It was a mirror held up to Africa's future and a challenge to America's strategy on the continent. Kenya now stands at a crossroads. What began as a war of words has exposed the deep fragility of a system that once prided itself as one of Africa's most stable democracies. A president accusing lawmakers of bribery, lawmakers accusing the president of feeding corruption, a speaker calling his own head of state a hyena. These are not the images of confidence. They are the symptoms of a nation tearing itself apart from within. The danger is not abstract. When institutions fight for survival, the people are the ones who suffer. Development stalls. Foreign investors pull back. Jobs vanish. Families struggle while leaders trade accusations like weapons. If unchecked, this storm could spread beyond parliament walls, spilling into the streets, fueling unrest and reopening old wounds of violence that Kenya still remembers with pain. But Kenya is not alone in this struggle. Across Africa, nations are asking themselves the same question: how do we fight corruption without destroying our institutions? Some, like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, have chosen radical paths, dismantling systems they see as imposed by outsiders and replacing them with models rooted in sovereignty and local accountability. Others, like Kenya, wrestle within the structures of Western-style democracy, often finding themselves trapped in cycles of blame and paralysis. For the world, the lesson is sobering. Stability cannot be measured only by elections or trade partnerships. True stability comes from trust between leaders and the people, trust that words will be matched by action, trust that institutions will serve the public good, not private pockets. Without that trust, even the strongest democracy can look as fragile as glass. So, we are left with a choice, not just Kenya, but all of us who care about Africa's future. Do we cling to systems that have repeatedly failed to protect the people, or do we demand something new, something bolder, something that places sovereignty and responsibility above power games? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should Africa search for leaders who can carry his vision forward without falling into the same traps? The storm over Nairobi is a warning to every nation. Power without accountability is poison, but so too is accountability without courage. The question is, who will rise to lead with both? Please share this video if you feel that Africa deserves better than leaders who treat corruption as a weapon. Subscribe if you believe the truth must be louder than the headlines, and tell us in the comments, if it were your country, would you choose the model of Kenya or the path of Traoré?